So good morning. My name is Bob Bordone, and I'm the director of the Negotiation Mediation Clinical Program. I want to welcome all of you here today and say just how delighted I am to see so many friends and colleagues and alumni and current and former students here. I'm going to make some more extensive remarks in a few minutes. But before I do that, we are very honored to have our Dean, Martha Minow, joining us today. But she has some other commitments, as you might imagine the Dean of Harvard Law School might have. So I'm going to very quickly introduce her, let her make her remarks, and then I'll make a few more remarks before we get started with the first panel. So I'm not going to give an extensive bio of Dean Minow. That is in your program. What I do want to say is anyone that knows Martha Minow's work knows that she's someone who's deeply committed to the study of conflict and to the study and practice of its more effective resolution. And her work really covers both domestics and international contexts. And for as long as I've known Dean Minow, she has really encouraged and supported the kind of work that HNMCP does here at the law school. When she became the dean in 2009, she continued to provide the resources and the support that has really helped this program grow and flourish here at the school. So I am deeply indebted to Dean Minow for all she's done to make HNMCP possible. And I ask you to please join me in giving her a warm welcome.
Well, good morning. And I have the great pleasure of helping to salute the 10 years of this remarkable program. When I was a faculty member and I heard about the program, I thought, well, that is way cool. Now, as a dean, when I have the chance to brag about this school, this is very, very much one of the top things that I talk about. And why is that? I guess I'm speaking to the converted. You're here, after all, at 9-ish on a Saturday morning. But the world is filled with problems that are of a severe nature. It's also, I think, a moment in the world, in this country for sure, but other places too, where there's a sense of exhaustion. And are there really even any ideas? Is it possible to do anything? And whenever I'm feeling that way, I look over at the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program, which is engaged in using creative thinking to design original solutions that address the systemic nature of problems. I mean, there's nobody else who's doing that exactly, except for people who now are inspired and in the network. I mean, one of the greatest signs of the success of the program is how others are trying to do something similar. So I want to give my personal salute to Bob Bordone, whose vision is manifest in every aspect of this program, from the content to the process, that's a big word, from the global to the local. Would everyone join me in saluting Bob? Well, my work is almost done. I do also want to commend whoever came up with the logo, because the idea of a bridge is absolutely central to what this work is. And everybody in this room understands that having a bridge from what's hard to what's promising, and having a bridge that connects people, that connects a problem to a solution, having a bridge that actually connects theory to practice, that's what the effort is. And I know you're going to have a meaningful day, and I'm very, very grateful to all of you for your role, in not only in celebrating this effort, but in extending its vision. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dean Minow. Thanks all of you for that really warm round of applause. It's really an honor for me to have all of you here today. People have come from very far and very near, but taking a Saturday out of a busy life really means a lot. So thank you. Before I introduce and frame some of the day's events, I want to just take a few minutes to actually offer some thanks to some of the people who made today possible. I'll probably do this a few more times, but I want to do it at the start. And I want to start with thanking Rachel Viscomi, our assistant director. She has really, since June of 2015, that is actually when we picked this date for this symposium. We knew it was the Saturday before the election, but we thought maybe it'll be a boring election, and and we don't want to have that hold us back. We didn't know it was going to be the morning of the MPRE, so I know that there are some 3Ls who are not here. But really, from that moment forward, Rachel has been the person who has spearheaded every aspect of this. And she does much more than that, because in addition to substantive help, she provides constant wisdom and counsel and support and a not too much but perfect dose of humor every day in our office. And she is a wise counselor and friend who's done a huge amount to make this program. So thank you, Rachel. So I also want to thank Christina Hayes, who I bet is not even here to hear the thanks because she's out there. So Christina actually joined our team about 5 weeks ago. And we told her, oh, we're having a big symposium in a few weeks. And, oh, there's a million things we haven't done. And somehow, so those of you who have seen the Broadway show Hamilton know that that's a quote. There's a million things I haven't done. But somehow Christina pulled this together with just a steadiness and aplomb, which is really amazing. I also want to thank, I guess, another person who's probably out there, Tracy Blanchard, who is our program coordinator. She, in addition to basically being the all-around problem solver of the clinic, has been a huge part of this event. I also want to thank the rest of our team, Sarah Budish, Heather Culp, Adriel Broshansky, and Rachel Kroll. There are going to be some other opportunities to thank them at different times for individual pieces. But without them, we also wouldn't be here. There's also many former staff members here. And last night we had a dinner where we actually had 15 former staff join us, which was a huge, huge honor. I particularly want to acknowledge Stephan Sonnenberg. He was our first clinical instructor, and although this may be challenged later in the day, I am going to be willing to bet that he is the person who traveled the farthest to be here, because he lives and works in Bhutan, and came all the way from Bhutan to be here with us today, which is a huge honor, and I'm really grateful for that. So I want to also thank, he's not here yet, but he's going to be coming, so maybe I'll say it at another time, but Frank Sander, who is very much an inspiration and mentor to me. He'll be coming, I thought he would be here, but around 9:30. So maybe I'll say some more words about Frank Sander later. So there's clients here. Thank you, clients. Thank you, former students. Thank you, current students. Let me say a little bit about the conference itself. As we thought about in June of 2015, how should we mark 10 years? We thought we wanted to do something that was both retrospective and prospective, and something that would add something to the substance of knowledge, information, and exchange. And so, therefore, a conference seemed to make some sense. And when we were thinking, well, retrospective, we thought a little bit about, well, dispute systems design. So actually, in 2005 and 2006 was the first time I offered a reading group on dispute systems design, actually with Frank Sander. And not so much had been written about it at that point. Some had been written. But we thought, this will be fun. Let's see what happens. It turns out one of the people who was intrepid enough to actually take that seminar, it wasn't a seminar, it was a reading group, Rory Van Loo, is here, and he survived, and that's good, and actually later became our first assistant director. But then in 2006, 2007, thanks to the support of then Dean Elena Kagan, we really started the clinic. And so dispute systems design will has always really been the bread and butter of the clinic, and will remain so, because as Dean Minnow suggested, that work is really important to how do we look at how conflict is handled in institutions and organizations, and think, how do we build systematic processes for the more effective management and resolution of that conflict? In the past 3 years, HNMCP has really begun to do work in a domain that is new for us, not entirely new in the universe, but I think somewhat new in the law school context. And it's really work related to facilitation and political dialogue. And my own personal interest in that work actually began in the last election campaign in 2012. And it was motivated by a number of things, although two particular things moved me. One was an episode of This American Life called Red State, Blue State, which if you haven't listened to this, I strongly recommend it. It's very powerful and saddening and challenging. And the other was we had been invited by a local faith community to facilitate some conversations on citizenship, faith, and voting. And I thought the facilitated conversations went fine, seemed nice enough. And then I had this enormous outpouring of appreciation and thanks from people. Like, this wanting to talk about hard issues has been on my mind for a long period of time. And thank you for creating this space. And the reaction really surprised me, and it made me realize that there is a real hunger and desire for spaces where people can exchange around their differences, and a sense that that doesn't exist. And so over the past few years, we've started some initiatives here related to facilitation and dialogue. In 2013, we offered a 2-credit class on facilitation. This year, that class is a 4-credit class. We also, with Rachel, we're running a reading group this semester called Political Dialogue in Polarizing Times, Election 2016, which is really fun, I think, for both of us, and hopefully for the students. And so our second panel today, our first panel is going to focus on dispute systems design, and our second panel is going to focus on the perils and the promise of facilitation and dialogue. After lunch, Anu Yadav is going to perform her one-woman show called Capers. This is a show that's based on the stories of families at the Arthur Capper Carrollsburg Public Housing Project in Washington who protested the demolition of their neighborhood. I had the honor of seeing this show this past summer, actually at one of our kind of sister institutions, the Consensus Building Institute. And I found it to be incredibly moving and powerful, and also serving as a way for us to afterwards have a conversation about what does it mean when we as conflict resolution professionals or students think about intervening in a community, and particularly a community that isn't our own. And so after the performance, Anu and one of the community members, who will actually be here with us, Deborah Frazier, will facilitate a conversation with all of you involved. So it will not be entirely passive. So in addition to the formal programming, I hope that you will find some opportunities to connect with old friends, to meet some new friends, and just to have a really good day. There are, standing up here, I can tell you there are amazing, amazing people in this room right now. So if there are people here that you don't know, introduce yourselves, because I know that this room is filled with incredibly talented, idealistic, hardworking, and fun people. So you've all been a big part of the last 10 years, and I hope you get to meet some new people while you're here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Rachel, and the first panel.
Fantastic. So let me just invite our first panelist to come up and grab a seat here in the front of the room. Okay. So good morning, everyone. So I'm very excited to be here today and to be with this incredible selection of panelists up here. I just want to say a couple words about how the panel will go. So essentially what I've invited our panelists to do is to participate in a conversation. So my hope is that we'll be able to engage some really interesting questions about the state of dispute systems design, particularly as applied outside the traditional institutional context, looking at how the principles apply in our communities, what makes that more interesting, more complicated, what challenges we face as we continue to move forward. And my hope is that you all, as questions arise, as comments arise, you'll feel free to participate in the conversation. So I will reserve some time at the end for questions, but I invite you to raise your hand and ask questions or make comments as we go through so that we can all essentially have a hopefully really interesting discussion. For the old Saturday Night Live fans, I was saying, think of it like coffee talk. We'll have some fun and we'll talk. So what I'd like to do is just say a quick word about each of our panelists, but I'm going to give you only the briefest teaser for two reasons. One is you have a bio in your program of each of the panelists, but also my hope is that as we talk, you will learn more about the work that they do and have done and the ways in which that relates to our topic this morning. So I don't want to give it all away at the front end. Okay, so let us see here. I feel like there was one other thing I wanted to tell you all, but that will remain mysterious. Okay. So I will just give you a quick intro. I'm going to start down at the end. Professor Josh Stulberg joins us from the Ohio State University, the Moritz School of Law, where he is the Michael E. Moritz Chair in Alternative Dispute Resolution and teaches a variety of courses related to alternative dispute resolution, has published an amazing number of things and done an amazing number of things, has mediated a fantastic and astonishing number of disputes that relate to all kinds of exciting topics that we may or may not hear about later this morning. Stephan, as Bob mentioned, you've heard that Stephan has come all the way from Bhutan to help us boost our gross national happiness. Hopefully by the end of this panel, we'll pass out a survey and we'll see if we've managed to pull that off. So Stephan was, in fact, the first clinical instructor here. He has worked on the faculty in Stanford. He is now helping to conceptualize and build from the ground up the first law school in Bhutan, which is perhaps the greatest dispute systems design project to engage. Great. And Stacie Smith joins us from Consensus Building Institute. And Stacie also has just many, many years of insight and wisdom to share with us. Stacie is a senior mediator and the director of the Workable Peace at the Consensus Building Institute. And Stacie has provided process design, mediation, facilitation for public processes in an astonishing array of different contexts, and hopefully we'll get to hear about some of those this morning. And I have particular pleasure in introducing Seanan Fong, who is an ombudsman, who is a founder of the Cylinder Project in the Bay Area, who is a mediator, and also one of my all-time favorite students, who did, in the course of doing his divinity studies here at Harvard, we managed to lure him over to the law school, to the dark side maybe, to do some work actually in a very local community. So here in Sudbury, where they were engaging a lot of challenges related to the way in which the community engaged challenging issues in a number of different contexts. So it's a delight to have Seanan here with us as well. So with that as a teaser, I'm going to just jump in and I think for the first question that I have, and I think I will pose some questions broadly, so feel free to jump in if people are, so eager to chat that we need a little more order. I will impose it. But just to begin, I think the first question that I was reflecting on and thinking about this panel are the ways in which we really can encounter a lot of additional complexity and challenge as we move out of a more sort of traditional institutional or organizational setting and thinking about dispute systems design. So if you were brought into an organization and you want to start to assess what are the disputes that are arising, what are the challenges that folks are hearing, you have a somewhat circumscribed set of people that you might look to for insight with respect to that, right? You might have a company email list. You might have sort of a set of people in different roles you would want to talk to in different contexts. And a lot of that is really blown out of the water as we start to open up the borders and as we start to think about kind of what is the community that we're looking to, how do we reach those people, how do we engage those people, how do we get buy-in or get sort of the mandate of even engaging that conflict to begin with. So I think there are a bunch of different complexities there, and so I'm curious just in a very broad sense, as you think about what those different types of dispute systems design look like, the difference between a more limited sort of organizational or institutional setting, and then the sort of broader question of how these principles apply in our communities. What strike you as the challenges, the differences, the things that we should be paying attention to and thinking about? Who would like to jump in first?
Well, since I'm clearly the oldest person on the panel and brought here for purposes of that diversity, I will start. But also gives me the microphone so I can make two prefatory remarks. It is a privilege to be here. And the gentleman that Bob Bourdon made reference to, who I'm very hoping will join us, Professor Frank Sander, is a person who has guided many of us. I've known Professor Sander for 4 decades. He is the quintessential example of a person whose dignity, compassion, humor, and rigor, analytical rigor, serves as a model for all of us to the work we're trying to do. So I am a Sander beneficiary, and it's a privilege to participate in some ways to honor him, but also to let you know that it is a privilege to be invited by Bob and Rachel to join this. You don't need to be reminded. You have 2 of the most talented, exciting, quote, younger people who are leaders in this field, and to both learn from, and they will learn from you. So it's a privilege. It's a privilege to be here. My interest in this arena is in scenarios that. Part of its history. I got involved in this because I was interested in whether or not there was a role for, quote, law-trained people to play when communities blow up. Baltimore, Ferguson, and I regret to report that back in the 60s and 70s when I got started, it was anti-war, civil rights, and the work we tried to do there did not solve problems for all times, as we see. But so my interest is in when a city like Sanford erupts over the Zimmerman verdict, or the Trayvon Martin shooting, the Zimmerman, and you got 30,000 people showing up for a dispute, for a protest march in the city, and there are concerns about that connect law enforcement to deeper issues of, why did that incident involving somebody who had never even sort of lived in Sanford, how did that trigger the kind of controversy that was involved? That's the setting and the image I have in terms of my own remarks. So I think Rachel is absolutely right. The question becomes, in terms of differences, of designing conversations that might lead to more sustained frameworks for moving ahead. The challenges are severalfold, but who the leadership is, quote, who the stakeholders are, becomes a huge challenge. People will self-identify themselves as leaders of various groups, from faith communities to youth groups to civil rights advocates. You've got changes in leadership, competing leadership. So that identification process is huge. I think there are a couple others, at least as I've reflected on this. Another is who's supporting the activity, and financially, who's supporting the activity. This is not, somebody's time and talent is being done, and at least in some settings, if you're talking to a university about helping to set up a program, there might be resources, a budget available. If the intervention comes because you think you might be able, you think a good idea might be of use in a situation. Do you come with your own money, or do you find it? So finance, sustaining presence throughout these conversations, I think, is another challenge. Let me stop at that and let others participate.
Well, I guess I'll jump in. I'm Stacie, and also really grateful to be here, coming from a sister institution down the road. So the work we do is in such a unique range of settings, right? Anything from a very clear, dispute or challenge or desire to partnership in a small, contained setting, to international situations, national or international. And so I think the challenge is having that bag of tricks or the tools that is broad enough to allow you to find the pathway in this very diverse range of settings, and not getting too caught up or too stuck on one idea of how you would go about doing it. So, for example, in addition to figuring out who the stakeholders are, which is always could be a real challenge in the more community situation where it's not necessarily clear who are the leaders, who's really going to get engaged. So really figuring out who are the right people, and then figuring out what's really the best way to involve them, right? So CBI does a lot of representative processes, right? We try to find someone who can represent the point of view for a limited or extended dialogue or discussion or negotiation process. And we like that because it's very clear, right? And we know who's at the table, and there's consistency, and so that's great. Except it doesn't work that way necessarily in some communities, right? You just don't have someone who really can represent a point of view and can come to the table on a regular basis or is going to be identified, right? So you really have to be more creative, be more open, and sometimes change tack partway through. So we like to do our assessment first, design our process, and then implement our process. And it's really much more circular than that. We'll have to go back partway through and say, you know what, I think there's some voices missing, or okay, we had this great public meeting. We had only one or a couple points of view there, and we were missing points of view. So we need to find other ways to make sure that those points of view and those ideas are represented.
So I'm Stephan. I'm going to also stick with the noble tradition of ignoring your question and instead
I actually felt those were quite responsive.
for the start,
Okay.
and instead pointing out
I bless it.
how
Carry on.
privileged I feel to also be here, and to have been part of HNMCP, because I think HNMCP is not just a very noble endeavor in terms of the projects that you do and the projects that and the sort of inspiration that goes out from HNMCP, but there's an internal component to it as well, which I think is the people who are touched by HNMCP, presumably the folks who are here, and many more out there in the world. I think working and taking these kinds of issues seriously also provides sort of a platform for personal growth long after you're no longer here. So I do want to thank, I mean, we have the opportunity to celebrate 10 years, and I think it's very worthwhile to celebrate how many people in just a short span of time have really been touched by this program. So thank you for that. But in terms of your question, that's one of the things that I think is unique about the methodology and the approach that HNMCP brings, which is that I don't think people can get away in this field with not being introspective and not reflecting also on who are we and who am I to come into a community, and what are my biases, and how can I challenge myself to not just come in with, as you said, here's my template, here's my approach, let's do it, let's plug and chug, first a focus group, then this, then that. But also, what do people what's my legitimacy, and how do I earn that? And how do I earn trust, and how do I build trust? And also, how do I challenge myself and my own preconceived notions? And I think that's very important, because many of us, particularly when we, quote unquote, decide to intervene in a situation or decide to get involved in something, we have a privilege that many people don't necessarily have, which is that we sort of have the agency, or we have the wherewithal. We just decide that it's somehow our privilege or our role to get involved. And some might say that's a hubristic decision. So there's a real, but what I love about this approach is that it doesn't just leave that untouched. You can't just say, okay, well, I'm somehow privileged, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it, and people will respect me, therefore. It will never work unless we are also introspective about ourselves. So I think that's one of the key components that I want to talk about.
Yeah, so I'm definitely honored to be here as well. Thanks, Rachel, for inviting me. I'm getting over a cold, but I'm clearly a novice at this compared to the illustrious people in this room and on this panel. So I am all ears for ways to do this better. But I've come at this from sort of the opposite direction. So my first exposure to DSD was in the context of the clinical project that I did here with the town that we were helping to kind of resolve difficult civil dialogues. And then after graduating from Harvard, I moved into the private sector and started working with companies and serving as an ombudsman for one company. So I was trying to take these insights from the community setting back into the organization setting. And for me, the biggest challenge or the biggest difference between the two settings was the location of a clear power, like a institution of power or a permission giver. In the town, there wasn't really that. It's not very clear. So it's hard to get legitimacy in one sense, but it's also easier to get access to people in another sense. Mm-hmm. When you're in the town, you don't have to ask for permission to reach out to, Joe and Jane and Jill in the town. You can just go out and ask them if we can talk, and we can do our assessment that way. But inside the organizational structure, there's a lot more rigidity, and especially within a mission-oriented kind of company or organization, I felt, and maybe this is just me, but I felt like I needed to get permission to reach out to certain stakeholders, or else if I did something, if I sort of took the initiative or took a step that wasn't endorsed by the powers that be, then I would be risking the whole project in the first place. So that to me was the biggest challenge of working in these two settings.
Yeah, so I want to kind of continue on this theme, which I think is really interesting, about sort of where you stand, your identity, your credibility, the ways in which you engage people. Because I think it's a really interesting one, and it was one that was just very, very live for the dispute systems design class I taught last spring. Students were very, in fact, we had a guest, I'll just give a quick story. Ken Feinberg was visiting, and one of our students said, you should be doing something in Flint. There should be a fund in Flint. And he said, well, I can't make a fund. Like, if somebody asked me to administer a fund, I'll administer a fund. But so far, no one has asked me. And the student was very adamant that, well, you have an obligation because you have a reputation to somehow build energy for a fund. And his view was, yeah, that's actually not my job, and I would lose my ability to, to intervene in some sense if I started making decisions about what the political will should be, right? I respond to the political will, I don't create it. And so I think it's this really interesting question around what role, what role should designers play? How can designers engage in communities? Do you wait for an invitation? What is the process of sort of thinking about your own role and how you explain that and engage that with respect to people who may, either be incredibly excited to have someone turning their attention to challenges or feel like actually you don't necessarily know enough, or, if you aren't part of the community, we can handle it very well on our own. Thank you very much. So I think there's a lot of richness there, and I'm just curious what thoughts come up for you all as you reflect on the question of sort of what that looks like, and yeah, I'll hold.
Well, let me jump in because Ken Feinberg was a classmate of mine at law school, and although he probably doesn't remember who I am, but we were, I applaud his work and couldn't disagree with him more about whether or not he ought to. I mean, that's a great question that was presented to him. And my own response is, in my experience in this, I understand the notion, you need an invitation to come in. I understand that, and I've just concluded over my life that if you wait, you're never going to be, you'll wait forever, particularly for issues like this. So I'm not saying Ken Feinberg ought to pull out his checkbook and go get donors, but the notion of the idea of somebody with that kind of stature, I would argue that, this kind of work might benefit from somebody who has that kind of reputation, quote, from the outside, but boy, you better assemble a team of people who are part of Flint and know the community and have that kind of sustained credibility. But the notion of trying to trigger conversations among community residents over how to deal with that type of immediate challenge, I think is the kind of work we ought to be doing. And to me, it piggybacks on what Stephan suggested, that in terms of one difference of this kind of work, I think, in terms of intervention, but Stacie's observation, what's the triggering event to sort of invite it? And sometimes it's a spark controversy that sort of gives one an opening to come in and explore with the possibilities for building structures to move ahead. But long-winded answer. I think part of this work is, and one of the reasons it will make it controversial is, what do you pick? When the timing of when you come in, and those are important challenges and questions to answer. But this kind of work requires being proactive because you're concerned about and believe that it's possible that if you help people come together and talk, there's power in talk, and you can make a difference.
Well, I can say this is a topic that we've been talking a lot about at the Consensus Building Institute because, we're a nonprofit organization. People come to us or we respond to requests, and that's helpful. We're helping solve problems, but we have started to see gaps in where things are not being discussed or resolved that we may or may not be, as the individuals that we are, well suited to jump into, but really trying to think about how do we think about our impact more broadly in this field and in society and in making change where we see the big problems that just aren't getting addressed. And what is our role, and how do we institutionally be more proactive, right, and go after things that we really see as opportunities and needs, where there is a matchup. We have to be strategic about that, right? So where are our skills, right? Where do we have credibility? Where do we potentially have leverage? Going into an area where we really don't know anyone and don't have credibility, probably lower priority than areas that we can claim more expertise and knowledge, or we have more partners or relationships. And so we have actually recently been trying to invest some of our own time and money in a more pro bono way to explore these potential areas, right? So one of the things that we just have started doing is, so we've done a lot of work with UN agencies. We do trainings for the UN Staff College on negotiation, on partnerships, on political acumen. But they're usually, they direct us on, and they bring the people. So recently we've designed a course that's much more us defining what are some of the problems in UN agencies that are not being addressed, right, and some of the capacity building issues, and we sponsored the course. And we did it for free, and we brought people here, and we did the course, right? So another example of this is dealing with the issue of retreat from the coasts from climate issues. We see, we're hired to do climate adaptation processes where people are actually making decisions about, where they build seawalls, et cetera. But in dealing with the really difficult emotional issue of people actually have to move, we decided, let's invest some of our time, bring together people from very different fields, including ANU, and that is how our relationship with ANU started, to really think about how can theater, how can drama, other approaches really help us to address deeply emotional challenges in a new way. And so we put together an event where we brought together people from very different fields who might help provide some insight on how we can do this work better. And we've now expanded from that to trying to implement some projects on the ground where people are dealing with these issues. So it is something we've been trying to think about as an organization. How do we be more proactive and go after these areas that are within our sweet spot, right? But that people haven't hired us or asked us to come in and help them with yet.
I've been smiling throughout your comments because I've known Larry Susskind for 40 years. No one is more proactive, creative, and all over the world. I mean, it's nice to have it tempered by capacity, but he's a great example of somebody who's just every day is thinking about a gazillion places where these kinds of processes might be useful.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just two things popped into my mind. One was, and I guess a common theme, which is the idea of sort of finding your convener. So like one of the approaches dispute systems designers can take is to kind of just say like, okay, we're dispute systems designers, like this is what we can do. And if you're somebody with a legitimacy or authority to convene a process, come to us and we'll help you with that process. But I think one of the things that as dispute systems designers can do is we can see design opportunities and then like maybe start thinking about what the design could be and then go ourselves like hire a convener to, or get a convener to hire us to be the person to do that job. So instead of sort of waiting around, one of the things that might be important is to just seek out who you think would be the right person for that job. So, so I'm also, so in addition to working with like one big company, I'm also trying to work with startups in the startup ecosystem to help that. So I'm pointing at Daniel Doctori, who's in that ecosystem right now. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is how to get startup founders and small startup teams to work better together. And applying the tools of dispute systems design, organizational design. And the problem with startups is that they're really low cash, they don't want to spend a lot of money. And so they're not likely and they don't want to spend a lot of time on doing things like process. So one of the things that I've tried to do is find who could be the third-party conveners for these startups in this startup community. And so what I've been trying to do is kind of reach out to accelerators and incubators and to co-working spaces who are all parts of this ecosystem, and to see if they can in some way be the sort of agents who say, this is something that's important, this is something that we can fund, and this is something that we're going to offer to the community as a whole. So that's kind of one thought that popped into my mind about taking the design initiative. And the other thought I had was thinking about the clinical project that we did with a small town. Our client, the HNMCP client, was the Sudbury Clergy Association. And so that was an interesting convener in this case. It was a clergy association, so it was an interfaith, it was a set of different clerical leaders, clergy leaders in the community who met once a month to have an interfaith dialogue among themselves. And they kind of had this preset, in some ways there was a preset legitimacy in the community because they were represented, or they were leaders of different subgroups in the community, the different religious groups. And in some ways, they weren't the perfect convening organization, but they were something, and they were able to bring in some sort of buy-in. What's the point there? I guess the point is that they don't have to be perfect, but you kind of bootstrap off of imperfect conveners along the way, especially in these community settings.
Yeah.
And I think that there should be more of a role. The unfortunate thing in American public life and civic dialogue is that the sort of civil society institutions are kind of breaking down. So we have less of those conveners around, but that's something we should work on.
Well, I want to sort of remind myself of one of the pretty early on conversations that I had with Bob when I just joined the clinic, and it was, I oftentimes had a lot of my work has been focused on human rights out there, and I remember one of the conversations that I had with Bob where he said, one of the things I just don't get is when the human rights people go out somewhere, they call it fact finding. That's so weird, because why would they not call it perception establishing or perception finding? And in my mind, I had this image of well, boy, that, I guess that's in line with our rhetoric, but, sometimes there's a fact, like torture, or genocide, or something, and I had these very stark sort of visions, and but I never actually forgot that conversation. It just stayed somewhere buried in the back of my brain. And then after being here, I went to join a human rights clinic, which then we rebaptized the Human Rights and Conflict Resolution Clinic. Maybe because I still couldn't really get rid of that sentence or that conversation in my head. And there's one project where that really came to life, where, liberated from the shackles of DSD, we had a client that had already pre-established a view of the world that was framed in terms of black and white, good and bad, perpetrator victims, very stark terms. And they asked us, can you go document how this particular actor has been acting in bad faith, and let's write a real nasty report about him, and let's try and change the situation because of that report. And so there was this sort of pre-implied theory of change there. And that's when I sort of, over the course of that project, which lasted 2 years, it was in Cambodia, and we were documenting whether or not sort of there was one institution that was there to improve labor standards in garment factories. And the accusation was that that actor had been acting in bad faith. Anyway, so over the time of that investigation, that phrase really came to life. And it came to life not just with regard to that actor, that in fact maybe black and white is the wrong frame, and maybe the theory of change, although maybe something will change if we write a real nasty report, maybe. But maybe something will just ossify, and stalemate itself even more, and in that case will have contributed to that. So that was a nice insight, but it didn't resonate with any of the other stakeholders or any of the other actors in that situation, because everybody had already polarized. And we were the only ones who were asking these, quote unquote, very academic, and people would say very aloof, or the stakeholders in that situation would say very aloof and naive questions. And so the project transformed from one of fact-finding and documentation and that to one of questioning and one of education and one of coming up with creative exercises to allow people to explore alternate realities to the ones that they'd already established for themselves. And so what was supposed to be a project that would have lasted maybe a year turned into a project that lasted 2.5 years. In the end, though, there was no black and white, and to me it was a really striking example of how important it is to take the time and to take the necessary time and to actually really engage in those creative education processes. And some of the hardest conversations that we had ended up being with our client, when we said, well, so we have spent actually more time than we originally thought. We've done more analysis and we've spoken to more stakeholders than you asked us to. And we think the situation's much more complex. And we would love to suggest for you an approach that might be radically different from what you already pre-decided. I see that as one of the most interesting and successful projects, I guess, that I've been involved in. But to me, it illustrated really how, this sort of conflict assessment approach, almost irrespective of what you've already decided is the best way to go forward. Just as a matter of course, you do this kind of a conflict assessment and you have to verify, is it really as black and white as we've thought in advance, or are there really victims and perpetrators, or is it much more of a systems problem, is absolutely essential, particularly for complex problems.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think what you're saying, the ways in which having a very fixed view of a situation can both blind you to what's happening and can also forestall the possibility of really helping communities to change. And I think that's really live in a lot of what we're seeing now. I will refrain from political commentary, but I think there are ways in which we've seen in this election really fixed and unchanging categorical views of who people are and how people behave and what people care about and how we value people have created a situation that makes it really hard. I mean, we have to get through Tuesday, but what happens after Tuesday? And how do we start to rebuild the way in which our people relate to each other and the ways, how do we find, it feels to me that any hope for moving forward is reliant in some way on people actually being able to recognize each other's humanity and sort of work within a more hopeful and sort of complex frame for who and why, how and why people are sort of engaging and what's driving some of what's happening. So just kind of springboarding off that, I'm curious, as we think about, not just drama around how we, the complexities of the ways in which we sort of see and categorize each other, but looking at our communities and a lot of the civil unrest and the challenges that our communities have faced, certainly with particular attention in the past several years. What advice would you give to someone who is, not a designer, who doesn't necessarily have training, but who is really concerned about the state of affairs? I mean, how do we start to move forward as people who are concerned about the state of our communities? Mm-hmm. And you can give designer advice too.
Well,
No, go ahead.
Well, I mean, this one might
and
sound...
I don't want to hear move to Canada.
No. This one might sound terribly
Or Bhutan.
Yeah. It's a very nice place. I mean, I'll give something that sounds very glib, and this is something that, I would hate to have this sound as though I've figured it out for myself. But maybe it's a really interesting so by way of context, I spend a lot of time on the coasts, the left and the right coast and whatever. My family's from the middle, the flyover states. It's always really interesting to go home because it's amazing to find how different when I'm now I live on neither coast or the flyover states, but when I was on how insulated and how much of a bubble there is, and how much the role of talking to people who think in similar ways and sort of commiserating and maybe joking and laughing, etc., how much it actually takes me also away from an objective standard. And then when I go to people who I respect and love and care about in a very different place, and it's just geography, how the rhetoric and the discourse is very different. And so maybe one way, in a very micro or very small way of doing it, and those sometimes can be uncomfortable conversations, and at times sort of the takeaway that people oftentimes say is, well, listen, let's just not talk about politics. Let's talk about the weather or other interesting, scintillating conversations. But maybe, particularly in times when it does seem like you're careening towards crisis as a country, or it's sort of increasingly polarizing, maybe it makes sense to actually try and engage with somebody and talk about it in a way that doesn't seek to confirm sort of pathology on the other side, or reinforce those kind of polarized viewpoints, but actually seeks to understand. And from time to time, there are very interesting news articles of that happening that I find to be personally pretty inspiring, of communities that have these kinds of conversations. I'm guessing we'll have some of that discussion later today. But those don't have to happen in big billboard poster sort of ways. They can also happen with classmates or in a small forum or just a small setting. And that's probably, in my mind, maybe the best way to reestablish civil society.
Yeah. So in some sense, sort of organic thinking about what systems might be helpful, because in some ways there are these disputes that don't have anywhere to go, and there is, I think, a hesitance among a lot of people to engage them because there's sort of a concern that it won't go well, right? If we raise it, if we engage it, it's going to feel really uncomfortable. People's feelings may be hurt, so they're either not engaged or they're engaged in a way that can be really explosive. And maybe in some sense that is a lack of structures that enable people to engage. Yeah.
I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this lately, and more and more feel, I guess I'm seeing the bigger systematic causes or underlying drivers, and trying to think about where my work and our work fits in to that. And one thing I think about is sort of this zero-sum thinking that is out there and that is driving a lot of civil issues, concerns, and I think there are other big drivers maybe related to that. I mean, I think as a society, how badly we deal with trauma, for example, and as trauma comes to the surface, how frightening it is for people to deal with, and how widespread it is just people don't want to engage and don't know how. I think another piece is, I guess, maybe connected with the zero-sum is there's the authoritarian strain of response to discomforting things or things you don't agree with, and a very sort of punishment-oriented rather than resolution-oriented approaches. So, I guess I'm sort of thinking about these big trends and where are our leverage points to help try and change frames of thinking about how we deal with difference and conflict and trauma and scary things in the world, right? So I think there may be some specific institutional places we should be focusing more energy. I think criminal justice potentially is a big one. Though even that, it's where's the place you get people to start thinking differently about punishment versus education, I think is a really big one, and I think especially the interface between education and criminal justice. We've seen a lot more attention in society focusing on that and how connected that is. But I guess I try to come into whatever project I'm working on or place that I'm intervening with keeping in mind this broader frame of anything I can do to help people see the opportunities for shifting that frame from zero-sum and very locked in to one that's more open and seeing the opportunities and the costs of just get my piece or lock those people out, or how we help people feel safer with that opening frame and seeing that actually their interests are not going to be met. Some interests, pedestrian interests might be met, but the larger society that they want to live in there's going to be really negative repercussions for continuing in that very negative frame. So I guess that's sort of how I've been thinking about it lately.
My take, if I understand it correctly, is I want to go back to a couple comments. One is, if the question was sort of what can you do, I mean, if we care about the community we live in, then it's talking about how do we help build resilient communities, how do we discharge our responsibilities and duties as members of a democratic society. I know it sounds like motherhood and apple pie, but I believe in it's the environment I grew up in. I believe in freedom and engagement and responsibility. So if the notion is one sees things occurring that warrant our attention, concern as citizens, we try to do something. I think it speaks to the question that was importantly raised, is who's the credible convener? And I don't want to be misrepresent this. My engagement is to feel a little more comfortable in terms of starting conversations about, in terms of talking to people of, would it be useful to have conversations about this, and if so, who do you think ought to be doing it? So that, for example, we're involved in a couple projects at the school where we're testing out different models for communities and government officials' plans for natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, things of that nature. But do we plan for civil unrest? And we did some research, and the answer was Seattle did a little bit, and no other community in the country officially sort of developed a plan for dealing with civil unrest. So we've tried a couple of experiments in, if you were, who develops the plan? And we've had a couple pilot projects where we've tested with different kinds of models. In one model, the question becomes who would be the person or entity that could convene, help identify and convene stakeholders to have a conversation about planning for civil unrest that would be a credible convener. So the role of the designer is to go around and sort of ask people who would be credible. We have one project where the conveners centrally involve the local bar association and the city government. In another project, it is a university, a recognized sort of group of professional dispute resolution people, and some city government. So I think the challenge becomes, if you see challenges, it's not to, I guess I was struck by the word client. There is no client inviting, who's inviting you in. The question is, are there ways to deploy the skills we allegedly have and the interests we have to convene, to explore engaging citizenship and conversation.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just had one thought about the question about advice for non-designers or something, non-professional designers. And the thought, just the image popped in my mind about, okay, all conversations lead to Trump these days. So Trump said, there was this moment when Obama was angry, made this speech about Trump, and Trump was like, Obama should reserve that anger for ISIS. He shouldn't be so angry at you for supporting me. He should show that much anger and that much passion to, to the folks in the Middle East or something like that. And I realize that there's like this type of anger that we have that we reserve especially for people that we're close to. And we get so angry. So ISIS, okay, they're supposed to be evil. But you're my fellow countryman, you are my fellow American, you're not supposed to be evil. And that's what makes me so angry that you're doing what you're doing. That's why it makes me so angry that you're saying the things you're saying. And I think that insight could be really useful for the people I talk to about how to deal with this kind of conflict inside their own homes and their own families around different political issues. And I think it's just to remember that the anger is there and the emotions are there because the person on the other side of the table matters. And so that gives to me a little sense of optimism that these dialogues aren't in vain and that it's just worth kind of experiencing that emotion just because it proves that it's important.
Right. So, I think there are a lot of ways in which one of the challenges that we face in any of this work is kind of normalizing the feeling of conflict and the emotions that arise because they are important parts. They're a glorious byproduct of humanity, right? Is that you're going to, if you care, you're going to have a lot of associated feelings that go along with that. And part of the challenge sometimes as a designer is giving people an opportunity to really explore and engage and go to those places so that you can try to build something from them as opposed to trying to kind of maneuver around them or bypass them. Yeah. I want to come back to this question of sort of, not having a client, right? Because I think there are a lot of ways in which that can make certain ethical questions easier. Mm-hmm. And I think it can also raise new ethical questions. And I'm just curious, as you reflect on design work in communities in particular, whether there are particular ethical questions that arise that you think we should be thinking about or attuned to or not.
Well, I'm sorry to. I'll go ahead. So I wonder if this question should be limited only to a DSD forum. I know that in a law school we've very established notions of attorney-client relationships, attorney-client privilege, legal privileges, benefits, et cetera, obligations that come along with that. But then there's also this strain of client-centered lawyering, which I wonder is if it's a different way of reframing the question that you said in a very standard traditional legal context, where, if I understand it correctly, you're reframing your relationship with a client within all those legal constraints more as a partnership and more as a collaborative enterprise also. And so does it really make sense to only pose that question here in the DSD context? Or is perhaps the DSD context one where we can be really honest about it and say, actually, we're structuring this relationship in terms of a partnership. We're structuring this relationship in terms of, one where we have certain resources, capacities, constraints, biases. You have certain resources, constraints, biases. And as long as all of us in good faith somehow hope to resolve the situation for the better, we can collaborate, we can work together. Of course, it might be much more controversial to raise that question when you have attorney-client privilege and all these things that are premised on a certain vision of a client-attorney privilege or relationship. But it's almost liberating to be able to just throw open that question and address it very openly in this kind of a context where I think you're right. It doesn't make sense, or you would have to really shoehorn the relationship of a dispute system designer into a constraint that doesn't make sense when you look at the work that we do oftentimes. So I actually think that this is my personal opinion, of course, that the kinds of relationships that we've been describing and that a typical DSD project entails can also be very instructive in other types of attorney-client relationships.
I mean, I guess one thing I would say is in every contract that we have, CBI has, we try to include a clause that says, you are paying us, but we don't work for you. Right, so who the client is, and we have to explain, right, that if we work for you, we can't achieve your goal, right? We have to work for all of the stakeholders, all of the people involved, and work for them equally, right? And so as you described, often our hardest work is negotiating with the client who comes in with one goal and one purpose, and we find out that the participants have different goals and different purposes, care about different things, right? And so in our work, a lot of the times the person paying us is a government agency from the town up to the international. Sometimes it's someone who's somewhat in the middle, it might go through the U.S. Institute for Environmental Conflict Resolution. They're officially paying us, but they're still getting the money from the National Park Service and the Department of Interior. And for me to have to go back to this national park and say, yes, what you want to do is just complete this plan, right, and fulfill your Section 106 consultation duties to talk to the consulting parties about the potential for destroying cultural resources. They actually really, really care about some other things, right? And we're not going to be successful in talking about in achieving your goals of your real long-term goals, which are stewardship of these places and resources over time, right? If you can't, for example, talk about fishing permits, right? Fishing permits they're like, no, this is not about fishing permits, right? But these stakeholders need to talk about fishing permits. You have a different dispute about fishing permits, and if we can't talk about that, right, we got to create space for that, right? Or we have to be able to open up and talk about the destruction of some of these cultural resources that happened under previous superintendents in the past. So, some of that really is redefined. It's not very often that we have no client at all. I mentioned a few cases in which we might proactively usually we have some kind of relationship with somebody who wants us to do something. But it's redefining who really we are working for and how we are and why. It's in their interest to broaden their conception of what it is they want us to be doing.
Sorry.
After you.
I definitely resonate with this question of who's paying you. That's the first question. So as an ombudsman, I try to just have like casual introductions to people in various contexts, or sometimes not so casual introductions. And I introduce the ombudsman role: neutral, confidential, independent, informal problem solver. And their first question is, but the company's paying you, right? And there's definitely this perceived conflict of interest. How could you possibly be an independent neutral if the company that is hiring us is hiring you? And this has led me on some sort of, I've tried to imagine, like, what would be the perfect situation where I could give the perfect possible response to that person. Well, my response now is the same. Like, they're paying me, but we're independent, and it's kind of like contractually and ethically we're separate. But I would much rather sort of say, well, actually, the company is only part of a consortium of companies that each pitch in to this independent fund that then hires these ombudsmen. And all these companies have signed on to these common shared values, and that's why they're all hiring the ombudsman as a demonstration of their commitment to their values. So that's kind of like the thing that has popped into my mind as a good response to that person. And I would love to see more people kind of working on these kinds of consortiums or these kinds of alliances around shared values. And there's a lot of momentum now in workplace settings where people are really invested in creating workplace cultures where there's a strong sense of values, especially for millennials. So yeah, that's just one of the things that I think is very promising.
It's a reminder to me that money is the source of all evil. This is a challenge, and those of you who, across the spectrum here in terms of mediating, I was the reporter for the committee to develop model standards of conduct for mediators, and there's a provision in there that speaks to compensation. Is it okay in terms of a standard of ethical conduct for a mediator to be compensated by only one party? And I can't tell you the amount of controversy that the posture of those who thought that raised problems in terms of the integrity of the process. There was an avalanche of criticism, and if you do that, we're not going to support the model standards. It's got to be the case that one-party payment is not in and of itself a disqualifying event. I think they're significant challenges. I think there are times where the payer, the National Park Service, the Interior Department might not undermine one's credibility. I historically was involved in a number of mediations of Native American land claim disputes. And let me tell you, if the Interior Department paid our fee, we wouldn't have been in the room. There would be no credibility whatsoever. So it's a challenge. I want people to be able to make a great living doing this kind of work. And for it to be recognized, but I think we have to be creative. I really like the notion of a consortium kind of approach. To go back to the comment, so I think ethics gets tied to, concretely to a dimension of financing. I tend to view intervening as initiating a mediation process. So if I go talk to somebody from my vantage point, my commitment to confidentiality, for example, from what I learned just in exploratory talks, I'm not. They don't have to worry that I'm going to go tweet it because I don't know how to tweet. But share it, or it's not going to come back to haunt them on the news. So that from my vantage point. It sort of goes back to this notion of client. All of you, with this wonderful course that Rachel and Bob have developed, to me, the signal failure of my lifetime of work in this design field that I care a lot about is designing systems to deal with claims of sexual harassment on campus. We failed. And I've tried within some institutions to sort of go talk to people. And, you know, I think your point about, you know, who might say no, are you a troublemaker for talking to certain people to sort of raise it, you know, who ought to be involved in the conversation. You know, I don't quite know the right answers, but I think the ethics issue is, from my vantage point, no one should feel uncomfortable talking to me about it, because I'm not going to, if it doesn't go anywhere, it's just Stulberg wasting his time. But it's, so.
There's also, so the issue also with working with entities like a town is that you don't want to supersede democratic processes, or even though the alternative dispute resolution process should be democratic, I guess. I'm thinking about the work in Sudbury, like these sorts of civic engagement groups should be democratic, but you don't want them to ever be perceived or ever be in contract, or, you know, opposed to like legitimate democratic processes. So when you think about sort of town meetings or something like that, these are supposed to be representations of the people's will, and you don't want that to be impinged upon. So like in the same way that ADR processes, like mediation processes, are in the shadow of the law, all of these processes should be in the shadow of like legitimate democratic deliberation.
Well, it's if they're legitimate, but you know, if you don't have a segment of the community participating in a town meeting because they don't feel comfortable, or if they're, you know, intimidated in one way or another from participating, you know, what's the value of not including?
Well, and also I would say, I mean, you know, there are real limitations to the opportunities for meaningful deliberation in a lot of these traditional forums, right? So town meeting, there's an article, you can potentially vote to modify it a little, but, you know, you've got a whole stack of articles to get through in the day, and there's really not very much room to find the middle ground on the two competing articles at town meeting, right? Yeah. Now, that doesn't mean you supersede town meeting, but for example, a process I did recently on the Cape where they'd been trying to get something passed at town meeting for 3 years, and it failed for 3 years, even though they'd go back and tweak it in between. What they realized is, no, we need a process in between before the next town meeting to actually shape the article so that the article itself is reflective of the range of interests of the people who live in the town, right? And so we convened a process over the course of a year where we revised the plan that was going to be put before town meeting. And so after 3 years of not being able to get it passed unanimously, right? So that was working. It wasn't going against town meeting, but it was fine. There are a lot of flaws with town meeting. I also wanted to respond to something you said, and I mean, I definitely see the problems with having one client paying, and we face them all the time. And your example of Indian affairs, I think, is a good one. You know, in our working with tribes, being hired by the Department of Interior, you know, a process we worked on, they spent over the 2-year process, and we had quarterly meetings that were 4 days long every quarter. You know, for the first 2 or 3 meetings, you know, they would kick us out for half a day to debate whether to fire us because were we really trustworthy, right? That was the cost, I think, of being, you know, hired and paid for by one party. But I think part of what we hung in there, and in the end, I think part of what we were trying to do is also educate the parties, educate the client that in the world we live in, someone has to pay us, and we really are able to work in a way that benefits everybody, right, and is attentive to everybody. And I think in the end, they walked away not thrilled that we were hired by the Department of Interior, but satisfied that the outcomes they were able to reach in this mediated process and having an external facilitator at the table, their interests were valued and attended to equally in the process.
And I want to support that, but also emphasize the notion of, who the we is. And the we, the issue goes back to credibility, and if the we is everybody that looks like me, white male, might not have credibility. But if you develop a team and there's engagement and trust, then at some point, who's paying doesn't become an issue. I agree with that. I agree with that. But I think, in light of this kind of conversation in terms of thinking about where these processes might be deployed, the we in the community of persons interested in dispute resolution has to be, we've got to bust it up in terms of becoming much more robust in terms of diversity along multiple lines to have credibility in communities we want to operate in.
Absolutely.
I wonder, sometimes, this is an interesting forum because I oftentimes also feel quite privileged to be doing this kind of work under the chapeau of a university. Obviously, not all dispute systems designers or dispute resolvers can be in a university because, well, for obvious reasons, right? But universities or programs like this one, like HNMCP, they do have a unique role because to some extent, you can get a bit of a pass on this very important question. And so collaborative relationships, for example, between an HNMCP and a CBI actually can do really well, because the stereotypes oftentimes associated with universities are those of curiosity, inquisitive mind, trying to learn, trying to seek knowledge, seek truth, etc. Of course, that's not always true, right? But there's a very unique and I think powerful role for university clinical programs like this one to play, not just in dispute system design, but also in other fields, where, for some cases, I would argue that universities are extremely well suited to make progress, where it might be more difficult, or there might be more of it might necessitate more problem solving for something like a CBI that actually has to have those difficult conversations that are less relevant in a university context. So there's a really powerful. And oftentimes I try to make that very explicit in articulating why clinics and clinical programs can be so useful in a policy-making context. Not always, not for all cases, not an exclusive thing, but just to recognize their importance for certain types of conflicts.
Yeah, and certainly the ability to do work pro bono, I think, can go a really long way toward
to do pro bono, and we have an answer that is difficult that's difficult or maybe impossible to give for something like CBI, which says, what is your motivation? Well, our motivation and our mandate is to teach at the highest level students how to do these skills. Yeah. That's why we're here. Yeah. And so that's something that's very difficult to say if you're already in the professional world. So sometimes there's a really interesting interplay there.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. I think being a nonprofit that is mission-driven, and I have arguments with my father about what's really the difference between a nonprofit and a for-profit. And to me, in my daily life, it seems there's a huge difference. We really are organized around a mission, and I think, I think we're perceived that way in the world. Our neutrality is what allows us to be successful, and we protect it. Right, so.
I just want to make clear, I wasn't in any way saying CBI. No, I just think that the partnerships is particularly valuable between those kind of, to provide the right answer.
To the question, to the person who's not, quote, trained in this and sort of speaking to the role of who has the credibility, not everybody can be affiliated with a university or have a platform of a not-for-profit. All of you in the room, are members of your community. You're developing your own careers, your own reputations, and, there are persons, and you don't have to be chronologically beyond 30 to be viewed with respect and valued member of your community. But, there are people, in Columbus, Ohio, there are, if you mention Robert Duncan is involved in, we have a controversy or, we need some thoughtful guidance, who does one turn to? There are people who have developed a reputation in terms of the quality of life they've led, the values they've led, the participating in the community. I think I used to live in New York City for a while. Ted Keel was the name. Everybody, he had a sort of a prominent role in labor relations. But so when controversies erupted and people thought about who one ought to go to, he was a private lawyer. Had nice offices, and people would meet there. But there's a sense in which who you are and the dignity with which you carry yourself and care about others is all one needs to sort of be tapped as a resource.
Yeah, great. And I want to I want to make sure that the audience has an opportunity, that you all have an opportunity to ask questions, because I think there are a bunch of different threads that have come up that might be really interesting to continue to pull on or to explore. So the floor is open. Who has a question or a comment they'd like to pose to our panelists or share with the room? But if you ask them all at the same time, it'll be so hard for us to hear and process. Yeah.
I have a question. How do you engage in the process when the stakeholders are not willing to engage? So basically you have someone outside the community, the system, who really see an issue that needs a resolution long term, and you have the stakeholders, they live with it and that's it. So how do you get them into a start? And I'm thinking of healthcare, which is not a community, but...
I think you need people who create, there's no way to force something. The commitment is if people want to participate or think it's in their interest to participate. And the question becomes, if they don't, if they think they don't need to, or it's a waste of time, or they're going to give up control, they're not going to do it. So that's what, from my experience, oftentimes, it takes a horrific event to trigger somebody's interest in wanting to, take over the university president's office or other kinds of activities that basically, I think, is an expression of interest, concerns, frustrations of a group of persons who feel that they have been dealt with inappropriately or been excluded and want to have a say in how their lives are going to be led. And you just, if that's not vivid to other potential stakeholders, I don't think the conversation, moves ahead.
I think, it's part of the diagnostic phase is if there are people outside, for example, who's outside of the situation, who see a serious problem that's affecting them and people inside don't want to work on it, the first question is, why? Why don't they want to work on it? Do they see their alternatives as great and they're not worried? Or are they worried about, they're hopeless that any sort of intervention would work, or they feel that the question's being framed wrong? Maybe there's a different thing. If you include that, they want to work on it. So, I think that's part of our role, is to sort of figure out, it's not our role to impose a process that people don't want to have, a conversation they don't want to have, but to figure out what is maybe the conversation is really about the enabling conditions. For that kind of dialogue. And you can't jump right into the dialogue. You have to figure out, how to help establish the basic levels of trust, for example, for people to be willing or interested in, hopeful enough that they could do this. So the answer might end up being there's actually nothing you can do right now. Nobody wants to do anything. then you wait for it to be a hurting stalemate further that people actually do, or they resolve it in their own ways. But I think the diagnostic questions of really why and what would make people want to go a different way, be more collaborative in how they resolve things. There may be things you can learn that would really reshape the question you're trying to ask.
I think there's also a lot of value in, so for example, one way of going about it is, well, there's no hurting stalemate, or it's not ripe, so there's no way of resolving this dispute. But oftentimes that's not a satisfying answer, which I think is the motivation of your question. There's some interesting research about sort of completely ossified conflicts, like for example in Sri Lanka, where there's very polarized communities and very, two narratives living side by side, and oftentimes they don't really interact. And the value in those kinds of situations of people doing very quiet and very human-focused sort of narrative work around how this conflict is impacting a specific individual. So, for example, if the question is, hey, who wants to go and resolve the DRC? Right? Probably most of us wouldn't raise our hands because it's so intractable. And yet there's huge value in writing stories that are persuasive and that are powerful and that are very human-focused on one particular individual and how she has been affected by the conflict, and how everything is nuanced, and she's not this side or that side. She's been affected over years, over decades by this conflict. And those kinds of stories that are very that are sort of that are built around, or that allow people to develop empathy with people who are quote unquote on the other side, oftentimes can help people understand why, even though I personally don't have a specific motivation to care about this issue, that empathetic bond sometimes helps people join the conversation and then get deeper and deeper involved into it. So I oftentimes feel like if there's some reason to not be satisfied with a stalemate or with a situation that's not ripe, then maybe it's time to turn to to pull out the journalism toolbox, or the sort of documentation and empathy toolbox.
Go ahead.
Only because I read about it here yesterday. Do folks here in the room, since you're all committed members of this Harvard community, at least as I understood the decision yesterday about the men's soccer team, is that viewed as an opportunity to at least explore multiple conversations that the question becomes what gets framed as the topic, but I want to at least clarify, I don't think one needs violence to acts of violence and that kind of disruption to trigger interest in conversations. And it strikes me that a decision like that, significant, is impacting a lot of people's lives multiple ways, whether or not that becomes an opportunity to think through how to create a dialogue among people affected. Do you think anything is going to happen?
I was going to say, sit at Josh's table over lunch and we'll figure it out. That's an invitation to take initiative if ever I heard one. Jody.
So the comment that I want to make is, in listening to all of you and talking about larger systems, as a family therapist and someone who works with an effective communication with families, that all of the things you're saying are what goes into systems thinking about family therapy and family systems theory, which is to find ways of entering, and also a shift from looking at the symptom bearer as the problem, but rather looking at the symptom bearer as the person who's carrying the metaphor of what the larger needs of the system are, and that's the only way to call attention to what's really needed. And it's often very disconcerting when a family or a couple comes in saying, it's because of him, and having to move towards actually but we have to thank him because he's called in all these other people that are involved in looking at what really would be too uncomfortable to look at, and that his symptom, or whatever it is something that has alerted us to the fact that we need to pay attention to something that is much more frightening to look at. and much more uncomfortable to look at, but is quite resolvable. It's often, as we look into it, it's always at least one generation back that we could go further. So that it's very much what you're talking about, but in this on a smaller system. And from my perspective, all of the things that you're talking about have to do with, additionally, each individual member of each thing you're talking about has a family story that also gets played out in every system they're in. So that's it.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of what that view, that perspective, Jody, I think also is really helpful as we reflect on some of those questions around how do you enter, but also how do you get people on board and engaged. And I think the framing in that way also takes some of it redistributes responsibility, accountability, the ways in which we are working together without one person necessarily having nefarious intent and I think, yeah.
And the relief for the person in discovering that the convener knows that it's not about this person. It frees this person often to begin to share, to point people in the right direction about what needs to happen.
So in some ways, I feel like that's a very hopeful note for us to close on. And so I know that I will continue to take a lot of the insights and reflections folks have shared with me into the rest of the day. And I hope that this is the beginning of a conversation that can happen over break and over the course of the rest of the day. But I hope you'll join me in offering our panelists